Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of the One the Many videocast. My name is Rob Guzman. How are you today? I'm doing well. So we got a busy program for you today. I've got 3 different issues that I want to cover, and I want to make this video a little more short, a little more pithy than I usually do, just so I have a little bit more of an audience. I think the longer the video, generally, the fewer people finish the video. So this time around, I'm going to try to be a little bit quicker in my answers. So let me know if you think that's better or worse. Glad to hear from my audience on all these things. So the first thing I want to talk about today is a story that's been percolating actually in my feed for a little while. I wanted to wait a few days, few weeks to talk about it, but here I am talking about it, and that is the cooperation between Google and China. So to give you some context, we have China is this authoritarian state that is fast moving, I think, towards a totalitarian state. You had several months ago, I think it was actually last year, where the Chinese president and chairman of the Communist Party of China, they basically abolished his term limit, made him president for life. And on top of that, China is now trying to implement this new policy, this new program that they're calling social credit, which is a way for the government to assign everybody in the country a score, a personal score out of 800 that tells the government how good of a citizen you are, how good of a Chinese citizen you are, how loyal you are. So what goes into this score? Things like what you buy at a store. Are you buying healthy food or are you buying alcohol and drugs? If you're buying a lot of cigarettes, maybe you get docked a few points. If you're buying healthy fruits and vegetables, that's good. You get a couple of extra bonus points. What else goes in? Who you date, who you associate with, where you work, how good a job you do at your work, what your family members say about the government and about other things. These all factor into their idea of a social credit score that everyone will have. Now, how are they going to do this? How are they going to implement it? Well, straight out of 1984, straight out of Big Brother. They're basically going to set up surveillance cameras that have facial recognition technology. They're going to put in recorders and basically monitor people 24 hours a day. Now, this is, I think, the first example of what we could call like digitized totalitarianism. This is a very scary development. I think if you have any friends or family in China, you should tell them to get out of Dodge, get out of there before this gets really bad. I don't anticipate it going well, but there's more to say on this. So not only is China taking steps towards doing this, which it has, it's been building for a few years now. Now we have an American company, Google, who is now actively cooperating with China in doing this. So how are they cooperating? Well, first of all, Google supposedly pulled out of China 8 years ago, but that isn't totally true. They left some employees there, they left some offices there. They have at least 700 employees right now in China. And Eric Schmidt, who is the former chairman of Google, claimed that he believes the internet's going to split in half, that one half's going to be run by America, one half's going to be run by China, and it sounds to me like Google is sort of hedging their bets. So what's the big project that they're using to help cooperate and build this bridge between Google and China? Well, that is this thing that they're calling Project Dragonfly, which is a new search engine, a censored search engine that Google will roll out to China eventually. It's still in the early phases, where you can only do searches if you log in, and the government will have the ability to blacklist certain terms, whether that's Nobel Prize information about things like Tiananmen Square, things the Chinese government doesn't want their people reading about. And so this is a horrific development. I think it's really bad. What are some of the takeaways here? Well, first of all, I want to say that Google is engaged in essentially So Google is a large company that has made wonderful products and reached a tremendous amount of wealth. And they only got that way by building up their company in the American free enterprise system. They basically required American freedom and American liberty to build their product, and now what they're doing is exporting their brand into markets that deny that very concept. So in a sense, Google is essentially slapping or biting the hand that feeds them in a way. But the more important philosophic takeaway here, the really important ethical and philosophic epistemological principle you should take away, is this idea that production, success, technological innovation cannot occur with force. The principle here is that the mind, to function properly, cannot be forced. You cannot force somebody to think. You cannot force somebody to innovate. In order to produce any technology or to create wealth, you have to understand the facts of reality. You have to understand the laws of physics. You have to understand the laws of chemistry. You have to understand how reality works. And to do that, you have to put no consideration above the facts in your mind. You can't put alongside understanding of physics and chemistry the dictates and mandates of the latest bureaucratic 5-year plan. Just because some official or some group or some person wants something to be true doesn't make it so. You have to actually examine reality and come to an understanding of reality in order to effectively manipulate and build on reality. Think about this and apply it to some real examples. If there's a plague, doesn't matter how much the government wants the plague to be fixed, you need medical researchers to understand the virus and create vaccines and antidotes. You need a doctor who's trained to identify the symptoms and treat those people in order to reduce the numbers of the plague. If you're building a bridge, we hear all the time about China creating these wonderful infrastructure plans. They can kind of snap their fingers and build a bridge, whereas the West has to vote on it or have multiple consumers buy into it, but the government can just decree it in China. Well, it's not exactly true. The bridge is built by civil engineers, people who have to understand the principles of load, who have to understand how to distribute mass. No bureaucratic order or gun can force somebody to do that. In fact, if you put a gun to someone's head and tell them, build me a bridge, they're going to do whatever they can to avoid death. Okay, they're not going to build a bridge that's going to, they'll do the best they can given the circumstances, but they can't be free. They can't be free to inquire. They can't be free to understand reality and learn the facts in order to come to an understanding of how to make that bridge the best they can. The best symbol for this, if you want a historical symbol to kind of put the stamp on this, is Galileo. Galileo had all these wonderful things to say about science when he wrote, and the most famous, of course, was the idea that the Earth is not the center of the universe or the galaxy, but that the sun is the center, and the Earth revolves around the sun. Now, the church wasn't a big fan of this doctrine, and they put him under house arrest, and he was forced to recant his view. In fact, at his trial, it was it said that he whispered as he was being led away to be put under house arrest after he recanted, and yet it moves. Essentially claiming that no matter what the official inquisitors had to say, no matter what the government at the time had to say, no matter what the religious leaders had to say, Galileo claimed at that time that the facts were the facts, and it didn't matter what other people had to say about them. So the takeaway here is you cannot force a mind. It's not possible. And the only way a dictatorial, totalitarian state like China can become a big brother, can do what it wants to do, is to basically be a parasite on freer systems. Whether that's a free system that existed before their government took hold, or whether it's a foreign power like the United States, which is mostly free enough for it to develop technology, things like Facebook and Google, and then essentially use the fruits of that technology, use the fruits of the freedom that those individual scientists and computer engineers had in order to erect this crazy totalitarian web, this totally bankrupt system. So I think that we haven't seen the worst of this story. I think it'll get much worse. And I think that Google's model used to be don't be evil. I think this is the pinnacle of evil, is to basically kowtow and cooperate, be a collaborator for a totalitarian state, or a totalitarian state in training, and essentially use what you have, use the freedom you have to deny freedom, to help this country repress its people. I think it's a totally bankrupt, it's ethically unspeakable, and I think Google should be ashamed of themselves. And I think that the response from the West should be that customers should boycott them. I think they should be penalized in the press. I think they should take a beating. And they've been evasive about this. They haven't really answered questions about Dragonfly. They've had a few of their employees have resigned. I think something like 7 have resigned. That is not nearly enough. You need a huge amount of people to resign here. And they have to resign for the right reason, which unfortunately in our culture, I don't think a lot of them understand the relationship of force and mine. They don't understand that these two are opposites. They don't have the proper philosophic foundation, and so they don't have the moral backbone to stand up for this for the right reasons. So that's what I have to say about that. This leads me, in a way, to my next topic, which is the appearance of the UN, of Trump at the UN. Basically, Donald Trump gave a speech to the UN last week. It was UN week here in New York City. It impacted me personally, actually. Where I work is kind of close to Trump Tower, so a lot of the streets were shut off. A lot of people were really inconvenienced on their commute. It was kind of annoying. But anyway, the papers reported this, and as usual, the media really disliked Donald Trump, and they kind of reported on his gaffes. They kind of pointed out that he was laughed at and mocked by the delegation there, and the paper more or less said that he was the laughingstock of the UN. And this was supposed to be evidence of how he's bad even in the eyes of other countries, and that he's reduced the stature of the United States by his antics. Well, I have a couple things to say about that. First of all, before I get to Trump's remarks, and I will analyze them a bit, and I'll give you my take on it. They are mixed, actually. It's not fully good. It's not fully bad. I will tease out the details in a minute. But before I do, I cannot avoid saying a few words on the UN, on my personal views of the UN. I think the UN is a complete disgrace. I think it is one of the worst organizations in the world. I think it was corrupt from its very inception. I mean, this is something that when the Soviet Union, the bloodiest dictatorship on the planet, existed, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were equal partners, founding fathers, essentially, of the UN. Today, they not only do they apologize for the Soviet Union when it was around, but you have Iran in the UN, a theocracy, a nasty theocracy that has nuclear ambitions, ruled by theocratic mullahs. Saudi Arabia, which treats its women horribly, was on the UN Human Rights Council for several years. Today, China, which is, as I was explaining, on its way to being a totalitarian state and is already an authoritarian communist state, and Russia have equal power with America on the UN Security Council. So you have a basically free country with an idea of individual rights being held equal with a communist and basically not really theocratic, but an authoritarian state like Russia. It's a complete disgrace. I think actually philosopher and author Ayn Rand, of whom I'm a huge admirer and follower of, once said of the UN, this is like a great quote by her, she called it that global citadel of hypocrisy, something to that effect. And she pointed out that it's essentially like a crime-fighting organization that has on its board mafia bosses. I mean, that's really what it is. It's basically supposed to be this wonderful force for global stability and peace, and yet it harbors all these horrible states and nasty regimes on the basis of like diversity or internationalism. That's the other thing about the UN. It's really who was enthusiastic about the UN were socialists in the early part of the 20th century. These sort of leftist, Marxist types who really wanted a global government and global governance. They didn't like the United States. They didn't like nationalism. I mean, I think nationalism has its problems, but these people were international socialists, and this was sort of supposed to be the precursor to an international socialist state. So today, there's no surprise you see a lot of leftists, modern contemporary leftists, even though they're not all really Marxist, really. They have a hodgepodge of ideas. They're still reflexively pro-UN, but why that is, we'll get into that another day. But I have to say, it's a horrible organization. If I were president, I would have kicked it out of New York a long time ago. I would have told them to go pound sand somewhere. I think the fact that they give aid to countries, these horrible dictatorial countries, they're just rotten to the core. Anyway, what did Trump say to the UN? Apart from my estimate of the UN, what is my estimate of Trump and what he said? Well, Trump said a lot of things. Let's talk about some of the good things. For one thing, he slammed Iran really hard, which is great. They are a theocracy. They are a nasty country. They're mystics, okay? They have nuclear ambitions. They hate the West. They took hostages from us in the 1970s. I believe, in fact, that the United States has been at a de facto state of war with Iran since then, when they took our hostages, and they basically helped incubate and create this radical Islamic fundamentalist movement that we're seeing today. It was really the government of Iran, the theocratic government of Iran, that gave the ideological authority and power to Al Qaeda and other the Muslim Brotherhood and all these other really nasty fundamentalist theocrats that we see coming out from the Middle East. So he slammed Iran. Of course, you had the traitors, the Britain, France, Germany, Russia, all these countries saying they were going to help Iran, like bypass the sanctions and stuff. This is rotten. I mean, these countries depend on the U.S. for their protection and their economic help, and here they are in true UN fashion helping this evil theocracy. He attacked Venezuela and in their leadership there. He attacked socialism. He said that the misery that's being caused in Venezuela is due to socialism. I think it's great for an American president to say that. Not enough of them do, and I think that's a fact. It is. It's because it's a socialist country. They have no individual rights. They have no economic rights. That's why they suffer there. He also attacked the idea of foreign aid generally. He said that we need to rework it and was a little bit more of a compromise position than a true principled stand that I would take. But he did say we have to stop giving money to countries that aren't our friends, which I'm a big fan of. So what were some of the negative things that Trump said? Well, of course, he defended his tariffs. He defended his tariffs against China, and he defended this idea of an America First policy and inveighed against what he calls globalism and said that he prefers patriotism, even not just in the U.S., but he wants other countries to be patriotic and not globalist. So I figured I'd spend a little bit of time talking about this idea of globalism, because I think that it's actually not a great term to use. I hate this term because you can never tell what anyone really means by it. There's two ideas in globalism. It's actually what we objectivists call a package deal. Package deal means it's two disparate concepts, two ideas that don't belong together. And they're often lumped together. Usually one of them is like a legitimate thing that's good, or at least something people can support with an argument, and the other is usually something bad. And whether you're trying to get someone to endorse it or not, it'll depend on whether you want them to like it or not. That's the side of this packet that will determine the side that you mention at any given time. So there's a lot of these package deals in our lexicon and what we say, but globalism is certainly one of those. So globalism has two components to it. On the one hand, it's used often to mean organizations like the UN or the EU, which are like global governing bodies, centralized international powers that basically invalidate local sovereignty, take over functions that local governments usually do. Typically, it's viewed as something that's not really democratic. It's kind of like a hodgepodge of different countries all speaking together in like a parliamentary system. They tend to advocate for things like open borders. They don't want to put up any trade barriers. I mean, there's a mix there, but most of that I think is quite negative. And on that sentiment, I'm with Trump. I don't think that it's good to have centralized authority. I don't think a global government is a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea for any reason. I can't think of anything good to say about it. I think if it goes bad, you have Big Brother. You have a totalitarian state that's taken over the world. And if you don't, you have no way. There's no competition. There's nowhere else to go if it goes bad. And any problem that you can imagine, it's solvable on the local level for the most part. And why not have like a dozen governments that respect individual rights? That's the essential. Government, the size of government actually isn't as important as what government is tasked with doing. That's another thing that's important. A lot of libertarians have this problem. They think big government is always bad. Well, that's not true. It's not big versus small. It's proper versus improper. It's rights respecting versus non-rights respecting. And that's the key distinction. So I think that the size of the government is less important than the what it does, but a single centralized government, it's more likely to go bad, and so I'm uncomfortable with that idea. But the other side of globalism, the other concept that Trump packages in with this is this idea of free trade, which is, we want to buy steel from China, we want to buy other products from Western Europe or Mexico. You have this mass supply chain, and the idea is you want to pay as little as you can for any given product, and you want countries that specialize in making a product efficiently to have that market and not worry about spreading industries across the country. Like, the idea would be, an anti-globalist, somebody like Trump, who's a protectionist, would say, well, it's unfair to the American steel industry if it's more expensive for American companies to make steel. It's not fair that someone can go to China and have their prices undercut. Well, the problem is that There's a reason why often it's cheaper to make products in other countries rather than the United States. It's cheaper to make steel in China maybe because they have fewer regulations. Maybe it's a less skill-intensive job, so people don't have to have as high a wage in order to have that job. Whatever the reason might be. And it could be a geographical thing too. I mean, let's say you're buying corn or some crop. There are countries that have more favorable conditions for growing those things, and so they naturally specialize. They can probably grow more of the crop, and they can then sell it for less. So the idea here is that free trade is beneficial to both parties. It's a trade, they both do it voluntarily, and it's in your interest to buy it for the cheapest price available, because then you can have money, excess money, go to other things. You don't have to worry about paying higher prices for the same good. I mean, you see this principle at work every day. Think about when you you choose to go to Walmart over going to like a mom and pop store. Walmart, you go because it's cheaper, it's more convenient. There's a lot of factors there, but ultimately, they compete with the mom and pop stores, and if mom and pop stores aren't as efficient, they go out of business. And that's good because that means the mom and pop stores can now do things that they have a comparative advantage in. So this is a concept in economics called comparative advantage, where you basically want to specialize in what you do best compared to other people. So, I mean, this is a very abstract economic concept. I don't want to lose you guys with this. But I guess the only takeaway I really have here is, aside from my attack there on the UN and how nasty and horrible it is that Trump is a mix. I've said this many times, but on economics, I think he's pretty bad on this tariff issue. I think that his attacks on Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, that's all good. The problem I have with him is on this idea of globalism. I think that he's right to be against the UN and the EU. He's not right to be against free trade. Free trade benefits everybody involved. It's always to the interest of everybody involved to specialize in what they have a comparative advantage in. And, you lower the price of your product that way. You can sell more. The people in your locale can buy it cheaper. You get more business, and it's a more efficient use of resources. That's the other thing that's really important. So it's to the benefit of everybody for there to be a free trade system, and that's really all I wanted to say there on Trump and the UN. So this brings me to the last of these topics, and you may have guessed, just based on the immense media coverage, that I'm going to talk more about this Kavanaugh confirmation situation and this whole affair and issue with these sexual assault accusations. So just really briefly, I want to just cover some of the facts that have developed since the last time I did a video on this. And I'll start from early in the week and move on temporally. So we had 2 new accusations come out against Brett Kavanaugh. The first originally was Dr. Ford, who claimed that he touched her, not just touched her, he held her down and tried to take her clothes off and rape her during a house party 36 years ago when he was in high school, and he was 17. But 2 other people have come forward. One is this woman named Deborah Ramirez, who appeared in an article written by Ronan Farrow in the New Yorker, who claimed that she was at another party in college at Yale with Kavanaugh, and that she was drunk and at this party, and he basically exposed his penis to her during this party. She felt really violated about this. She claims that she heard his full name mentioned, and she said that he was standing over her and was pulling his pants up so that it was his penis in her face. Nobody at that party can corroborate that story. In fact, most of the people she's named, everyone she's named, either claims it didn't happen and they can't remember it. So, and of course, Kavanaugh denies that. The other is from someone named Julie Swetnick, who basically came out saying, and she's been, her lawyer is this guy, Michael Avenatti, who's the attorney for Stormy Daniels in her suit against Donald Trump. And essentially what she claims is that Kavanaugh and his friend Mark Judge of the Ford accusation fame engaged in prepping women for being gang raped when they were in college at Yale. So that sounds like a pretty fantastic story. Again, no evidence, no corroborating witnesses, just her word, and the denial, of course, from Kavanaugh. So what happened? Well, on Thursday they had hearings for this. They had Dr. Ford and Kavanaugh testified to the Senate about their experiences and their recollections of what happened. So I'll just quickly summarize what I took away from that. So Ford's testimony was very quiet. She was kind of mousy. She looked very uncomfortable. She said she was terrified to be there, but felt like it was her civic duty to be there. So she was kind of giving her facts the way she saw them. Kavanaugh, on the other hand, was very emotional. He was very angry. He came across very in a fighting frenzy. He basically claimed that the Senate was out to search and destroy him. That's the words he used. He said that they're not looking for advice and consent. They're looking for search and destroy. He said the whole thing was political. It was a politically motivated attack on his character due to people being unhappy with the election, with Trump, and that it was ultimately revenge for the Clintons, is what he said. He called the whole thing a circus and said it was a national disgrace. Other big moments from that I remember that I thought were pretty pivotal. Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator, basically got really hot and heated. Said that this whole thing was a sham, that it was the most unethical thing he's ever seen, and that if anyone votes against Kavanaugh on the basis of this, then they're legitimizing something that shouldn't be legitimized, this horrible attack on an individual, an attempt to smear him and delay a confirmation of a Republican justice. So I thought that was pretty powerful. Friday, after the testimony, they were going to call a vote on Kavanaugh. The Democrats left the room when this was supposed to happen. It was all very dramatic. They couldn't countenance this. They were in search of their smelling salts and their fainting sofas. Meanwhile, there was a lot of hullabaloo about this guy, Jeff Flake, senator from Arizona, who in the morning said he was going to vote in favor of Kavanaugh, and then changed his tune in the afternoon, saying that he wanted the FBI to investigate all these events. And he claimed that he just wanted it to last a week. He said a week would be enough. There were a few other people, Collins and Murkowski, two other Republican senators, came out in support of this as well. And so the vote was delayed. There will be another investigation into this Kavanaugh affair with Ford. The FBI will do it. It will be the 7th investigation conducted by the FBI on Kavanaugh. And one thing that was kind of suspicious about this was Flake. He flaked. He lived up to his name. But in the morning, he basically was for voting for Kavanaugh, and then during the day, he was basically confronted by a couple of women in an elevator, leftist activists, who claimed they were survivors and that they were basically really on him to explain why he was supporting Kavanaugh. He looked very uncomfortable. He looked, I was seeing people on Twitter saying that the pose that he had with the senators, he looked so ashamed of what he was doing, very torn. They said that would be a great Baroque painting, which I thought was kind of a funny remark. But, that's where we stand. We're waiting for the investigation to come now. The FBI is going to be checking out the details of the story. Now, around the story, what did we see? We saw tribalism, intense tribalism and anger on both sides. We saw women and men, their supporters, carrying "Men are trash" signs and T-shirts around the Capitol. We saw equal numbers or comparable numbers saying that they stand with Brad and that they need to confirm Kavanaugh now. There was a lot of partisan energy behind this. A lot of people were swarming the Capitol, protesting all about it, making it into a gender issue, making it into an attack on white men and so on. The usual tripe that we hear from the left. And the usual suspects came out to sort of give their take on the testimony. So you had people like Chuck Schumer, Mazie Hirono, and Chris Coons saying, on the one hand, this is not a criminal trial, they said, and so the presumption of innocence doesn't hold. That only holds in criminal trials. This is a fact-finding case, and so we don't presume his innocence. Well, let's talk about that for a second. Of course it holds. Of course the presumption of innocence holds. It holds outside of criminal court cases, not because, for the very reason that it holds in criminal cases. The fact is that innocence until proven guilty is, like I had said in my earlier video, an application of another principle to law. Law is a field, a science on its own, and we are applying a wider principle, the principle of the onus of proof belonging to he who asserts the positive. In any assertion, any claim, it is incumbent on the person making the positive claim to provide evidence for the claim. Otherwise, if you allow in people to say whatever they want and put the burden of proof on people to refute that, you allow in all sorts of arbitrary and irrelevant things that are impossible to disprove. And I gave the example of the panda at the center of the universe last week. There's other or the center of the earth last week. There are other examples. If I accuse you of stealing my TV, and the TV is not in my apartment, and the authorities come and now I tell you have to disprove that, there's no end to what I can say. You can say, well, I have an alibi, I wasn't around. I can say, well, you hired somebody to do it. You hired someone to come to my apartment and steal the TV. And then you say, well, I don't have any record of me taking the money out. And I said, oh, you laundered it through a Swiss bank account under a different name. And we have to look for that. There's no end to the irrationality if you allow in these things. So this idea that because it's not a criminal trial, you can just throw out arbitrary things and that there's no burden of proof on he who asserts the positive, that is epistemologically unjustified and it's total nonsense. So as far as that goes. Now, two other comments. So that was one comment we heard. Another comment we heard was, he was angry. Look at him during that testimony. He was so defensive and upset. Doesn't that prove that, he doesn't have the right temperament to be a judge? Doesn't it prove that he could be a rapist? Look at him. Some people were even saying that, look, he's so angry. Now, one person, I think it was some CNN analyst, I didn't see, it was on Twitter, I can't remember the name, said, well, now we know what Kavanaugh looks and sounds like when a woman tells him no. On the basis of him getting angry during a testimony? Because they've insinuated all these things about his character. They've attacked him relentlessly. They've attacked his family. He's now called upon to sit in the national spotlight and defend himself against all these horrible charges. Wouldn't you be kind of testy? Wouldn't you be kind of angry? Wouldn't you be righteously angry? So I think this idea that his temperament is all wrong. It's also an example of moving the goalpost. This is a common fallacy in logic. When someone says, well, we need to prove X, and let's say you fail to prove X, they move the goalpost. They change the standard. They say, well, let's instead try Y. So they've moved the goalpost from saying we need to prove that he did it to now, maybe he did it, maybe he didn't, but look at his temperament. Isn't that reason enough to throw him out of the confirmation process? This is a classic case of moving the goalpost, and it shows a lot of dishonesty on the part of the people who are putting forward these accusations and supporting Ford in her testimony. So, what are my thoughts on this? Where do I land now after seeing the testimony? Well, for one thing, some organizations like the ACLU have come out saying that she was credible. I'm even seeing analysts, people I respect online, coming out and saying, well, watching the testimony, she seemed like a credible witness, and he seemed credible, so I don't know who to believe. Well, that's true. But on what basis do you say that somebody is or isn't credible? Is it on the basis of a televised testimonial in front of a whole bunch of people on TV? We don't know anything about this woman. We don't know her mental stability. We don't know if she's a consummate actor. We don't know if she really believes this stuff, or maybe she had some other trauma in her life that she's conflating with this. We have no basis for any of it. That's the problem with this whole thing, this whole circus, is that it's not objective. There's no evidence, there's no corroborating witnesses. And one of the reasons for that is because it's so far in the past, all possible evidence that you could use is basically gone. It's been removed by time. So the fact that we're now trying to play this he says, she says game and figure out who's more believable on a witness stand, that is completely unobjective, not objective, and I don't think anyone has any basis for saying that either one of them is credible based on what they're saying, because think about what credible means. Credible means, is what they're saying consonant with the facts? Can I believe what they're saying? Well, how do you prove what they're saying is true or false? And even if it turns out that, say, something he said during the testimony wasn't true, or something she said in the testimony is not true, well, they're lying or bending the truth in that instance, but does that mean the event didn't happen? Does that mean that they're always lying or always telling the truth? There's really no objective way to validate this, just on the basis of the he said, she said accusation and a little media circus that goes with it. So I'm pretty loath to say that I believe really either one. Now, I will say it's very possible, and I think the simplest explanation, really, is that something did happen to her, but it's not clear to me whether it was this time around, like during this party, or maybe there was another more serious assault that's fragmenting her memories. This is a common occurrence with post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, a lot of people say that you never fail to remember your attacker, but that's not true. Studies have shown that when you get attacked and you're traumatized, you can, your memory is not better in those instances. In fact, the trauma can actually hurt your memory. So I don't really know if he did it or if it did happen, but if it did happen, I think there's some reasonable reason to believe it did happen. Something happened just on the basis of her actions. We don't know when it happened or who did it or, if it has anything to do with Kavanaugh. So it's not really objective. Now, this whole thing about the FBI needing to investigate, and it kind of goes along with what I just said. What do they expect to uncover? What do they expect to find? I mean, are they going to interview Mark Judge? Are they going to interview some of the other people that are claimed to have been there? Well, they could do that, but then those people have within their rights to plead the fifth or to say nothing or to say they don't recall. In fact, saying I don't recall is the safest thing because they're not saying that it didn't happen. It's just saying I don't remember it if it did. And so it kind of covers all the bases. So if the witnesses decide to do that, then what are they going to do next? I mean, they could go to, there was like Kavanaugh's calendar. I mean, sure, if they can date the ink or whatever on that, I don't even know how you ascertain that that's a legitimate calendar. How do you know that all the things he had on his calendar occurred and that he went to all of them? I mean, the whole thing reeks to me of just non-objectivity. It's all subjective. It's all speculation. And I think for that reason, that's why it's turned into a circus. It's because there's no real interest here in the truth, one way or the other. It's basically one tribe fighting against another tribe. And it's not clear to me who's the most contemptible in this story. I still think Dianne Feinstein's pretty contemptible for holding the evidence and waiting to the 11th hour. But I mean, I'm loath to believe that this is something that we can ever get to the bottom of, just on the basis of the facts. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that we have a statute of limitations, right? We have a statute of limitations because eventually it gets to the point where you don't have evidence one or the other. It's been too long, and so your case kind of dries up. The last thing I'll say about this is, so I mentioned that I don't think that, it's going to really achieve anything. I don't think the FBI is going to find anything further. And I think a lot of the arguments that the Democrats and other people who have come out in the media have said about him and his testimony, what it says about his character, I don't really agree with any of that. I still think a lot of this is very arbitrary. And I think that it ultimately boils down to a political calculation by them. But I want to put out one more thought here. And this is something I didn't say in my other video, but it's something that I kind of thought from the beginning, but I, wasn't fully sure of it, but I thought about it a little more, and I'm pretty sure of this now. So let's suppose that by some method we could find out that this happened. Suppose Mark Judge comes forward, they penetrate his defenses, and they get him to admit that he was there and that he remembers it was Kavanaugh. And now, Kavanaugh is sort of caught in this contradiction. Well, what does that say? You have a 17-year-old guy who's drunk, who doesn't have great memory of what happened. I mean, he might be telling the truth. He doesn't actually remember doing it. Maybe he had a lot of bad habits. He was not a great person back when he was a teenager. But what does that say about him now? What does it say about him as an adult? I mean, this pattern of abuse and alcoholism and all the other things they're accusing him of, there's no evidence of that having followed after his high school years. There's no evidence of it among his coworkers or anyone else he's interacted with. All the women that he's interacted with since then have said only good things about him. In fact, glowing things about him. And does this say much about his ability to be a fair judge and arbitrate? I don't think so. I don't think you have to be perfectly moral to be a judge. I think that the standard here of going back to someone's yearbook and saying, what did they write? Did you boast about the size of your genitals? Did you talk about how you want to, bang somebody in the class? What does that say about your ability now to be a judge? I mean, did we do this to Ginsburg? Did we do it to Sotomayor? Did we do it to Kagan? Did we do it to any other justice? Did we do this to, John Jay when he was running for the Supreme Court, back in Washington's term? I mean, this is kind of crazy. I mean, where do you draw the line? If a 6th grade boy throws rocks, or maybe 5th grade, I don't know. I was pretty good as a 6th grader, but I'm sure there are people who are nasty to women and girls, in the schoolyard. If somebody is playing tag and throws a rock at a girl and breaks her glasses in 6th grade, does that show now he's a woman hater, a misogynist, and he can't be a fair judge? How about 8th grade? How about 9th grade? I mean, where do you draw the line? I mean, yes, the guy was 17. It was clearly closer to adulthood than a 6th grader, but 17 is still actually a minor. It's still a child. He's not fully rational. He's not fully an adult. His character hasn't been fully formed. I mean, I made mistakes when I was a 17-year-old. I didn't assault anybody, but I also wasn't totally angelic, and most people aren't. They make mistakes all the time. So I don't know that this is something that we should take as a reason not to confirm him if he's a good judge and if he's got a good record and people agree with pointing him on the basis of his work as a judge. Quad judge, I don't think this has anything to do with it. I think, I leave that as a question to you as the viewer to think about and ponder. I'm not fully sure that that's valid, and I'm open to hearing the other side on that view. But that's my view right now, is I don't think that even if this were substantiated, that it necessarily means he'd be a bad judge. So there's that. So that about covers it. I tried to be as quick as I could this video. It's still pretty long, but more than happy to hear comments, questions, concerns. My email is going to be listed in the description here. You can also follow me on Twitter. You can check out my blog where I post all my videos. And leave comments in the video if you think that anything I said was wrong, or if you're interested in hearing more about something and want me to clarify. More than happy for all that. Anyway, have a great week. It was nice talking to you again, and I'll see you soon. Bye.